Well, at this time of year, of course, we're thinking about the arrival of a son. That's just in the air, isn't it? And I decided that I wanted to talk about the miraculous births. I think these stories really help us. They provide footing for us in shaky times, for us to go back into our history and read those foundational stories and consider them, and then to see how they anticipate the Christ. I think it would be really helpful. And so last week, we looked at Abram and Sarah, the birth of Isaac. And this week, we want to look at the birth of Samuel. But in thinking this through, I got to thinking about the birth of our first child. We were 23 years old, we were living in San Francisco, and we decided, great idea to have a baby. And I was pretty scared about this, like a lot of young fathers are. I was really nervous about how this would work out financially, how can we finish our education, how's it going to, just where are we going to live? Just all those questions are swarming around in my mind. But at the same time, I was very excited about this. And in both of our families, Judy's and mine, babies are a big deal. We get real excited about babies. So this is just always something that we were going to pursue no matter what. So in due course, Judy became pregnant, and we were both working at this college in San Francisco, like I said, where we had an apartment on campus, and everything was looking good. She seemed to be healthy. And when the day came, it just seemed like, okay, now is the time. And we had to go down to this big hospital in the city. And we went down there that afternoon, and they checked her out. They said, oh, you're too early. Go home and come back when you're ready. That's happened to a lot of young couples, especially the first time. So we went back home, and Judy lay down on the bed, and I was really hungry because I missed the, you're going to sense the trauma that I went through in this whole deal. And so I fixed myself a beautiful set of scrambled eggs. I had toast going. I had all this happening. I was just sitting down, and Judy said, it's time to go. I said, what about my eggs? I just made eggs. So that didn't go over too well. So it was time to go. So we drove like crazy back to the hospital because now things are happening. And this is really intense, and I'm really nervous. We pulled up to emergency, we got out, we got Judy in, and we got her going. In that hospital, this is back in the day a little bit, there were labor rooms where you could be by yourself, and then there were birthing rooms. They were about half the size of this whole complex, and there might have been 4 or 5 or 6 women, kind of cordoned off by curtains that were all giving birth at the same time. You don't really want to go in there. So we went into this little birthing room, and we're there. Now, we had a friend named Cindy, and Cindy had just had her baby about a year ago, so she was kind of like an Elizabeth figure to our Mary figure here. So she was there to provide counsel and support me. I didn't have a clue, and this was the first time for Judy, so Cindy was just a real calm voice of reason for us, which we needed that day. So she's there, and at one point, Judy just was having trouble breathing, and so they got a paper bag, and she was breathing in the bag, and said, where's my bag? I need a bag. And so nobody was really worried about me, and I was upset about that. But, well, what about me? I'm the dad here. Why are you shaking your head like that? It's not nice of you. Come on now. So anyway, we were going through all that, and at a certain point, as things began to intensify, Cindy pushed the doors open to that larger room, and she yelled out these words, we've got to push. I didn't really know what that meant, but all of a sudden, these hospital personnel came scrambling in. They put Judy on a different bed. They started wheeling her out. A nurse literally threw some hospital gowns at me. She just threw them. They hit me in the chest. It bounced the floor. So I got the gown, and I put that on. I didn't know you were supposed to put it on backwards, and so I put it on with the front open. It was wrong. They mocked me for that. And nobody really took the time to help me get this gown on right. Can you believe that? So anyway, I come out of the room, and I'm kind of doing this. I'm trying to put the little foot covers on. And I said, where's the other one? I can't find the other one. And he said, Darrell, that's the hat. So, all right. I'm struggling with this here. We go into this large birthing room, and there are things happening there, like there's some women giving birth. Okay, I'm not going to say much more than that, except that one of them was swearing like a drunken sailor. So all this chaos is going on around us. And it seems like this baby, this child, am I getting this right, you? You doing okay?
I'm not saying a word.
Okay, so all this chaos is happening around, and the situation is really intensifying here. And I am just leaning over Judy. I'm just trying to hold her hand. I'm trying to provide comfort for her. You can imagine how well I'm doing at that. And so I'm just there, and the doctors and nurses are doing their thing. And so I'm there, and at some point, it just seemed like it got quiet. And it just seemed like we were the only two people in the world. And there we were. And I leaned over at her, holding her hand, and I said, Judy, this is life. This is God at his creative best. This is wonderful. This is life-giving. This means everything. I just looked down at her, and she looked up at me with those big, beautiful eyes of hers. And she said, drop dead. You did this to me. So there we were. Well, in just a matter of seconds, the nurses handed me this little bundle, all wrapped up, my daughter, and she felt lighter than air, I can tell you. And I had no idea that I could ever love something the way I loved that child in that instant. And there we were. And so I called my mom down just across the bay, and I called her with the good news. Good news, Mom. We've got a little girl. And over the course of the year, some of you heard this, we had 3 more daughters. We went through a couple of miscarriages in that process. So if any of you have been through that, we can feel that with you. We felt that loss, but we've also felt the great joy of these daughters coming into our lives. Our daughters grew up. They're all married. 3 of them have 2 boys each. So we had 4 daughters, then we have 6 boys, and now our 4th daughter that recently got married is pregnant, and she's due in a matter of days, just a couple of weeks. She's living in our home right now with us, and so we're gonna have another baby come into our home. And we don't know the gender of this child. My daughter chose to wait to surprise everybody, which has caused tremendous consternation in our family. Her sisters have been just hammering her about this, because we don't know whether to buy pink or blue and all that kind of stuff. But very soon, we're either gonna have a son in a few days or a girl for the first time in a long time. Most of us are pulling for a girl. And when that child comes, that will be good news that will be shared out across our extended family around everywhere. Well, this kind of thing happens all through the Bible, and it's really foundational. You go back and you look at Sarah and Rebecca and Rachel and Samson's mother, and today Hannah. And this is a theme, and especially it becomes this idea of fertility is seen as a gift from God. And if fertility is not there, it's not available, it's seen as either a punishment from God in some cases, or the result of God closing a womb or God withholding. And then when God remembers a woman whose womb is closed, then he opens that womb and then she becomes pregnant. And some of these women who are barren, who are told that they're going to have a child, that is a harbinger. That is a forecast of something special. Every time you see that in the Bible. And so it's really a fascinating thing to walk through this and see how the Lord works. And all of it is about him keeping his promise. That original promise in the Garden of Eden, when he said to the woman, you will bear, I will give you a seed, and your seed will crush the head of the serpent. And that seed, that idea of seed, is that line that's going to go all the way down through biblical history, all the way to the Christ. And what did the Christ do? He is the one who crushed the head of the serpent. And so all of these stories really are about that fulfilled promise of salvation. Now, as we come to Samuel here, the backdrop is really Judges, isn't it? It's when everybody was doing what was right in their own eyes. It was a terrible time of warfare and cruelty and disobedience and the total collapse of society. And then here comes this great book of Samuel, which is about Israel's first kings, Saul and David. But it's also really forecasting the great king. And in these stories, we see who God is and what he does and what life is like with him and what life is like without him. And these stories are part of our family heritage. Just like the story of the birth of my first daughter has become part of our family heritage in our clan. These stories are part of our greater family heritage. And so we come to 1 Samuel here, and this is just fantastic storytelling like we find so often in the Bible. There was a certain man. Hey, isn't that great? It kind of reminds you of that once upon a time. There was a certain man who lived in the hill country, and here was his name, and here was his sons. And he had these 2 wives, and one was Hannah, and one was Peninnah, and Peninnah had children, and Hannah had no children. And boom, we run right smack dab into our conflict. Every story has a conflict, right? That's the plot arc, right? You have a setting, and then you have a conflict, and you used to have more conflicts and complicated, and then you have a climax, and then you have a new setting, a resolution leading to a new setting. Any story you've got has got that. Well, here's our conflict. Hannah had no children. And we're immediately alerted to Hannah's problem. And her problem of barrenness is maybe reflective in some ways of Israel's spiritual barrenness. It's also interesting that in this story, the setting is the temple. There's a priest named Eli, and he's ministering at the temple. And so a lot of this activity takes place around that. And we see in verse 6 that her rival, Hannah's rival, used to provoke her and irritate her because the Lord had closed Hannah's womb. So this is grief added upon grief. Imagine if you're a woman and your main reason that culturally, I mean, in the time, your main purpose was to bear children and you couldn't do it. And it was never occurred to anybody that the problem might be the husband. That just wasn't part of the deal. It wasn't part of the thinking. The problem was the woman. The Lord had closed the woman. And then you've got this kind of sister wife thing happening here. That's not of your making. It's not your desire. And she has children. And not only that, but she's provoking. This is terrible. This is a hard thing. This is a bitter thing that's happening. And look at verse 7. So it went year by year. She would go up to the house of the Lord, and this woman would provoke her. And so Hannah wept, and she wouldn't eat. And Elkanah reflected something that I was kind of reflecting in a funny way. So why do you weep? Am I not good enough? What about me, he says. Shouldn't I be enough of a man that overcomes this loss in your life? He doesn't understand what he's saying. He doesn't understand what he's doing. Am I not more to you than 10 sons? The answer is, well, no. Not really. You're great, but no, I really want to have a son, she would say. So that was her problem. And only God can take care of this problem. And in this context, the problem would be answered by a newborn baby, an innocent child, vulnerable, that would a man that would grow up and accomplish God's great purposes. That was the answer to the problem. Well, notice that she prays in verse 9. After they'd eaten and drunk in Shiloh, Hannah rose. And now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat beside the doorpost of the temple of the Lord, and she was depressed. And she prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. We see a little further on over verse 12, she continued praying before the Lord, and Eli saw her mouth. Hannah was speaking in her heart, only her lips moved, but her voice was not heard. So she was kind of whispering, you might say, or she was her lips were moving, but she wasn't speaking out loud. And so Eli thought, well, she's drunk. Woman, how long have you been drunk? But that's the passion of her prayer. She is waiting and she's worshiping. And I think this, in this sense, Hannah provides for us a real model of what to do when things are terrible. She's waiting and she's worshiping. She had every reason to be bitter. How might you have responded to your husband's other wife in that situation? I would think things could get pretty hot. But instead, Hannah turns to prayer. Her circumstances drive her there. Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote in The Cost of Discipleship, we are privileged to know that he knows our needs before we ask him. This is what gives the Christian prayer its boundless confidence and its joyous certainty. It matters little what form of prayer we adopt or how many words we use. What matters is the faith which lays hold on God and touches the heart of the Father, who knew us long before we came to him. Genuine prayer is never good works, an exercise, or a pious attitude, but it is always the prayer of a child to a father. And there's Hannah. Hannah praying at the temple with the priest there. Well, what does she do? I mean, she's got this great problem. She's got this great prayer. She's also got a pretty interesting promise. Notice in verse 11, and she vowed a vow. She said, "O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look upon the affliction of your servant and remember me, and not forget your servant, but will give to your servant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and no razor shall touch his head." So what's that about? What do you mean he's not going to? He's going to let his hair grow? What's the deal there? Well, it's really something that's called a Nazirite vow. And it meant that you were giving this child to the Lord, and there's certain things that are not going to happen. He's going to have a certain kind of diet, and he's going to have a certain kind of dress, and his hair is just going to grow. There was another guy who took this similar kind of vow named John the Baptist. Similar deal. It was also something that was given to a previous biblical character named Samson. So here is this great promise. And look what happens here. And she's having this conversation with Eli the priest, and he thinks she's drunk. He says, "No, I haven't had wine or strong drink. That I'm just pouring my soul out to God. Don't regard your servant as a worthless woman. For all along I've been speaking out of my great anxiety and vexation." There it is again, the depths of the pain that she's going through. What does Eli say in verse 17? "Go in peace. The God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." She said, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." Then the woman went her way, and she ate, and her face was no longer sad. Interesting. Before she was so upset she wasn't even eating. Now she's eating. She's a transformed woman based on this promise. She was greatly distressed before. Now her heart is at peace, no longer sad. Verse 19, "They rose early in the morning and worshipped before the Lord when they came back to their house of Ramah. And Elkanah knew his wife Hannah." That's biblical reference, for they had sexual intercourse. "And the Lord remembered her." There's that idea. The Lord remembered her again. "And in due time, Hannah conceived and bore a son. And she called his name Samuel, for she said, I have asked for him from the Lord." What a great story. What a great reversal of fortune. And so the story goes on at the end of chapter 1 there. It tells about the birth of this young man, and then Hannah's prayer in chapter 2. And just to set us up for where we're going into the New Testament, I want to just show you a couple of the phrases from her prayer here. Because Hannah burst forth in praise. Down in verse 5, here's what she says: "Those who were full have hired themselves out for bread, but those who are hungry have ceased to hunger. The barren has borne 7, but she who has many is forlorn. The Lord kills and brings to life. He brings down to Sheol and he raises up." This is that great reversal. Verse 7, "The Lord makes poor and he makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up the poor from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap. He makes them sit with princes and inherit the seat of honor. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and on them he has set the world." Here is a prayer that it's got cultural and political ramifications, doesn't it? Like it's really big. In fact, it's very it's very revolutionary, I should say. There's a lot of people, a lot of fat cats who really wouldn't want this prayer to be read. In fact, that's happened a few times. There have been a couple occasions in church history where this has been read, and some of the powers that be say, let's move on from that. Don't really want to get into that. So this is a very great statement of what God is doing. He is turning things around, not just for this individual woman, but for a whole nation. And that's really the point here when you come to Samuel, because these are people that are troubled and it's chaotic and they need leadership. And the book of Samuel is all about how that leadership comes and transforms the nation. So there is Hannah and the birth of her son. Now, if you have been reading in the New Testament lately, especially in the Gospel of Luke, you notice I'm hearing some pings. I'm hearing some echoes when I read in Samuel. So let's go there. Let's go to Luke chapter 1. Last week our story took us into Matthew. Today we're going to look at Luke. And we just want to see about some of these echoes from the story. You might call them gospel echoes or something like that. So here we have in Luke chapter 1 another birth story of another woman who is barren. And this is Elizabeth. And we have another temple setting. This time the priest there that we're reading about is Zechariah. And he gets confronted by this angel, and he's told that he is going to have a son. Look down at verse 13. But the angel said to him, do not be afraid, Zechariah, for your prayer has been heard, and your wife Elizabeth will bear a son, and you'll call his name John. And you will have joy and gladness, and many will rejoice at his birth, for he will be great before the Lord. Now, this is mind-blowing to old Zechariah. Not quite sure he can believe it, so look at verse 18. Zechariah said to the angel, how shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is advanced in years. Now, last week, that's like a direct quote from Abraham. How is this going to happen? I'm old and full of sheep. This isn't going to happen. Well, in this case, you know the story if you've read it. The angel closes his mouth, and he's unable to speak. And then we come down to verse 26. Oh, by the way, I should say that Elizabeth did conceive, and she was pregnant. And then in verse 26, in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to a city of Galilee named Nazareth, to a virgin betrothed to a man whose name was Joseph, of the house of David. The virgin's name was Mary. And he came to her and said, greetings, O favored one, the Lord is with you. But she was greatly troubled at the saying and tried to discern what sort of greeting this might be. And the angel said to her, do not be afraid, Mary, for you have found favor with God. And behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son. And you will call his name Jesus. And he will be great. And he will be called Son of the Most High. And the Lord God will give to him the throne of the father David. And he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. And of his kingdom there will be no end. And Mary said to the angel, how will this be, since I'm a virgin? The angel said to her, the Holy Spirit will come upon you. The power of the Most High will overshadow you. Therefore the child to be born will be called Holy, the Son of God. And behold, your relative Elizabeth, in her old age, also conceived a son. And this is the 6th month with her who is called barren. For nothing will be impossible with God. Did you hear that? Nothing will be impossible with God. And Mary said, behold, I am the servant of the Lord. Let it be to me according to your word. And the angel departed from her. What I think is amazing about this is that Mary expressed surprise and questions that are pretty similar to Zechariah. He got his mouth closed. Mary was able to just burst forth in praise in a song that so reminds us of what Hannah prayed. So there's this marvelous little scene where Mary goes and she visits Elizabeth, this woman who's a little further down the road. You know, it wasn't like she just went around the corner here on this field. She traveled 100 miles. Probably a young teenage girl in that time frame. Traveled 100 miles. It was important for her to go see Elizabeth. And the two of them just got together in this most amazing scene where when Mary arrives, the child in the womb seems to know and burst forth. And we're getting this quite a bit now with our daughter who's pregnant. She'll be sitting there and all of a sudden she's going, whoa! The child decided it's time to move. Got to shake out of this position. Got to spin around or do something, whatever they're doing here. And so that child did that to Elizabeth. Just, wow, the baby leapt for joy. And so what does Mary do? She burst forth into song. And the first part of her song really talks quite a bit about herself. She reflects on the fact that she is a servant in a humble estate. But then look at verse 50. She picks up all the same themes that Elizabeth had centuries before her. And his mercy is for those who fear him from generation to generation. For he has shown strength with his arm. He has scattered the proud and the thoughts of their hearts. He has brought down the mighty from their thrones and exalted those of humble estate. He has filled the hungry with good things. The rich sent away empty. He has helped his servant Israel in remembrance of his mercy, as he spoke to our fathers, Abraham, and to his offspring forever. Mary stayed with Elizabeth for about 3 months, and then she went back home. Well, here it is again. This downfall of the privileged, this great reversal, this exaltation, this lifting up of the humble. And again, we're reminded that this story does impact these individual women. Hannah and Mary, their lives were changed. They got what they always wanted. But it wasn't just about them, it was also for Israel. And this was a new era that was dawning. In fact, when you think back on these stories, you think back on the birth of Isaac to his formerly barren mother, that Isaac became part of that group of patriarchs that formed the linchpin, the foundation of the faith. You think of the birth of Moses, another one that was pretty shaky. I mean, it didn't have the same kind of miraculous qualities as far as his birth goes, but the circumstances surrounding the birth of Moses and how he ended up in the king's court and how he was able to lead his people to salvation from the Egyptians. And then you think of Samson, another Israelite who expressed then Israel's dominance over the Philistines. I mean, just this amazing reversal. It was a big deal. And then here, Samson, that we just looked at, the dawning of a new day, a new kingdom was coming in. What about Jesus? And this is where we just kind of want to revel for a minute. And we just want to reflect a little bit here. And I want to read you what I think are some of the most beautiful, small in some ways, and quaint, but earth-shattering verses, words that have ever been written. Luke chapter 2. In those days, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus that all the world should be registered. This is the first registration when Quirinius was governor of Syria. And all went to be registered, each to his own town. And Joseph also went up from Galilee, from the town of Nazareth, to Judea, to the city of David, which is called Bethlehem, because it was of the house and lineage of David, to be registered with Mary, his betrothed, who was with child. And while they were there, the time came for her to give birth. And she gave birth to her firstborn son, and wrapped him in swaddling clothes, and laid him in a manger, because there was no place for them in the inn. There it is, the birth of Jesus, an eternal, cosmic turning point. Everything changes. And there's so much to think about and so much to talk about here. So if you are God and you say, okay, I've made this world, and they've been rebels, and there's chaos, and it's damage and destruction and disease and war and all these things, I'm going to go fix that. I'm going to send the most vulnerable thing you can imagine, a baby. What's more vulnerable than a human baby? There are other animals, you might say, in the animal world, that when they're born, if they're left alone, they're in great danger. But there's a lot of animals that when they're born, they're off doing their thing. But a human baby is so vulnerable. You have a child born, and if you just leave that child there, it will die. It's inevitable. So there is a human physical vulnerability to God's approach here. There's even, we find out later in the book of Revelation, that there was even a kind of spiritual vulnerability as the dragon is there waiting to receive this child right out of the womb and devour him. Jesus is so vulnerable. But he is born, and he's born according to ancient prophecies, hundreds of them, that defy any mathematical calculation. Jesus is the fulfillment of all that. And he grows up and he carries on his ministry, and he starts in motion a new faith, a new religion, we might even say. And it starts kind of small, even though it's growing fast, but it results in the world's largest faith. It results in the downfall of Rome. The Roman Empire, by far the most dominant political, cultural force in the world of the day, and Christianity undermines that and brings it down. Read the history of the fall of the communist bloc in the late 80s. So much of that degradation of that empire had to do with Christians. Christians were a very big part of the undermining of the communist bloc. So there's political fallout. Think of what's happened with the spread of learning. Wherever Christianity goes, you know what you get more of? More literacy. You get cleaner water. You get better technology. You get more education. All of those things increase wherever Christianity goes. Think about art and music and literature, all that have come out of the story of Christ. Think about human rights. When I was a kid, when people talked about human rights, that was considered kind of a left-wing, liberal thing that somebody's pushing. And that's sad, because human rights really are born out of the gospel. The idea that we're all made in the image of God, and therefore need to be treated in a certain way. So human rights, the ending of slavery, the expression of compassion, particularly in medicine and hospitals. Hospitals and medicine were led by Christians and churches, started all those things. The development of marriage and the family, the total reversal of women. You go to the ancient cultures that we've been reading from, and even many cultures today, and the plight of women is deplorable. And women's value increases, and the way women fare in a society is always better, where the gospel has been dominant. And same with children. Back in these days, boy, if you didn't have the right gender and you didn't want it, you could just take the child and throw them away. And that was fine. And so a society that doesn't value children, Christianity fights against that. That's why we find abortion so abhorrent, and we're going to keep fighting until we die. That's not okay to take a human and cast them away like that. Governments, legal systems, justice, all of these kinds of things turn on the birth of this baby. Just think about that. If you want to see about the impact of Christianity on the world, what I would encourage you to do is to take a globe. Let's go to a globe and trace the geographic movement of Christianity in history from the birth of Christ, to see how it goes north, and then how it goes to the west, and then how it goes over to continents, and just see where it goes. And then ask yourself, where would you want to live? Under which governments would you want to live? Where do millions of people want to go from, and where do they want to go to? Just ask yourself that question with your globe there, and you will see the impact of the birth of this child on the world, on economies, on governments, on cultures. Now, it's not perfect, of course, and even these places where Christianity came to dominate, there's all kinds of problems, all kinds of troubles, and all kinds of hypocrisies and all kinds of things. It's never going to be perfect until we get to the new creation. Now, the birth of this child, I kind of like talking about all these big global trends and all this big stuff. And it is about that, but it's not just about that either. It's also for you. And this can be a great gift. This reminder can be a great gift for all of us of this good news. We come back to that, don't we? And that's what the gospel is ultimately. It's good news. It's good news of great joy. Look down at chapter 2. We're back in Luke chapter 2. And here we have this account of the shepherds. Brian alluded to this in his prayer. I'm sure you heard it. Verse 8, in the same region there were shepherds out in the field keeping watch over their flock by night. And an angel of the Lord appeared to them, and the glory of the Lord shone around them, and they were filled with great fear. And the angel said to them, fear not, for behold, I bring you good news of great joy that will be for all the people. For unto you is born this day in the city of David a Savior, who is Christ the Lord. And this will be a sign for you. You will find a baby wrapped in swaddling cloths, lying in a manger. And suddenly with the angel, a multitude of heavenly hosts, praising God and saying, glory to God in the highest, and on earth, peace among those with whom he is pleased. That is the great news that we're standing on. That is the great news that provides us that history when we look back. It provides us with that optimism and that future hope for our destiny of where we're going. But it also helps us for right now with whatever's going on. This is the good news. This is the gospel. This is our foundation. Amen?